I'm making this video a second time, which is really irritating. Yeah, I use the waterproof camera, and yeah, you just can't do that after it's been in the water because the microphone gets water in it. Anyway, okay, Euphemism video quickly. And yeah, I really do have to organize this content because, people do keep bringing up issues that I've already gone over many times in videos. And that's just sort of a waste of time, so I do have to watch my videos, I guess, and index the content. Ew. Yuck. Anyway, alright, so the quick rundown. Alright, here we are on planet Earth. How did it get here? So yeah, the cosmos and all that kind of stuff. There's the Big Bang Theory, pretty much the theory. But it doesn't really matter. You can just make up any kind of origin. It just doesn't matter. It's a physical origin. It's elements in a dance, okay, where they're synthesized inside of suns. The gravity is formed. Photons and elements of energy coalesce. They get to a certain pressure and they basically start fusing hydrogen into helium, and there you're off to the races. And then when they explode, they synthesize the helium into a bunch of other elements, and so you end up with 100 or so, and about 70 of those are relevant to anything. But anyway, and so then these elements are blown into the universe by explosions of these suns, and over time they form solar systems with these rocky planets with these elements in them. And so we're sitting on one of these big balls of elements. Somewhere in our history, 4 billion years ago or so, in a sea that was sloshing about, no doubt, and in probably no oxygen atmosphere, but it doesn't matter. These elements created amino acids, chains of links of compounds, because the elements keep banging into each other. They combine with each other. Some are very reactive. They'll combine very easily. Oxygen and carbon and the thing where stuff we're made out of is very good at doing that combining thing. Lithium, all these things are really good at calcium. They're all good at combining. And so they end up making very long and lumpy chains of elements, chains of atoms. And some of those can be quite eccentric and interesting. And depending on the formation or how the elements are smashed together, you can get things like diamond or ruby or emerald. But for compounds, they can't take that kind of pressure and heat. So most of that chemistry requires a medium temperature, and so if the conditions are right and you slosh around some of them, apparently 4 billion years ago here on Earth, they created a replicating cell. So one cell is the descendant of all this matter. All of it is the same race, so to speak. All of it's of the same family lineage. All of it has the same origin reproducing chain of DNA molecule. And whatever the perfect storm was, to form the first cell, we know that even though this is covered with parts, body parts, car parts, let's say just think about it as a car, and you want to make a car. Well, this place is just littered with car parts. There's wheels, steering wheels, engines. It's all over the place. Every part you could possibly need to make a living thing is here. But there's nothing arranging them. Somehow arranging them is not that easy to do. Arranging sufficient parts. And the real sufficiency of it requires this idea of a membrane that filters content coming in to a chemical system where a DNA molecule is basically separated. Something has to unzip it down the middle. And that unzipping process leaves you two pieces of DNA that will replicate, that will find, like a magnet, they'll find if you take off their A, they'll put a new B. If you take off a B, they'll put a new A, that kind of thing. So they will reconfigure themselves back to their original state if they are exposed to these building blocks. And that's what we're made out of, half dozen amino acids, and that's the game. So anyway, this event took place, though, where this molecule in a membrane, a circular tension filter, a sphere of filter, however you want to look at it, were combined, DNA molecule in the membrane. The membrane you can just take a little bit of it and separate it, and it'll reform itself like a water bubble. You cut it in half, it'll create 2 water bubbles. Well, the DNA molecule is a little more complicated than that. It has to have the machinery to do that, but the idea is the same, is that you're going to split the hardware of the cell is going to split, and then the DNA molecule is going to split. And the DNA molecule is basically the blueprint of the organism. That's the thing that now is going to be replicated. That's the key replication, the fundamental replication. And we're just the extension of it. So anyway, it goes through this process 4 billion years ago, creates these little cell bots, these copies, and they're now basically thrown into the world to compete with each other. Part of the game is going to be surviving each other's consumption, because the name of the game, to repeat, is to duplicate yourself, is to put paper in the copier, so to speak. Yeah, you got to feed the engine of the copy. You can't make the copy without ink and without paper and without all the mechanics of it. And so there's this battle to make copies, and whoever makes the most copies wins. In the early days, that's probably the only game in town, was make as many as you can, suffocate everybody else, you win. But eventually that strategy doesn't work, because if you make too many copies of yourself, you can imagine that you would just cover the earth, you would all suffocate and die. And the earth, the original cells probably went through lots of exterminations of that variety, and they had to go back to an earlier composition that was hiding under a rock somewhere and start over again, because it just didn't work. They self-terminated through overconsumption. So then built into the mechanism was a death process. Okay, anything that replicates now on Earth pretty much dies. It has to die, because it has to make room for its copy. And so that's part of the deal, is mortality built into these little bots, and so that makes them even more clearly focused on this task of replicating. So they live to replicate, and through this battle botting, they start acquiring nuances and advantages. Some get a lump on their head, and that lump makes them able to pop the other guy's membrane, so he's going to win. And so there's just tool making. So over billions of years of tool making, you go through trilobites and all these other little bugs and different kinds of varieties of life form, and they all figure out how to capitalize on a niche to get enough food. And they're just machines. They're just biological machines designed to for the environment, the niche they're capitalizing on, and to take full advantage of it, and to be dominant and to reproduce successfully. And that's the game. And then for 3 billion years, that's all there was. Then 500 million years ago, the game changes a little, because now the tools are getting more and more sophisticated. And so you have these complex features, like you have mouth parts and asses and tails and all kinds of different kinds of parts. And now these parts need to be oriented so they can be effective, as you know, to be used effectively. There's no point in having legs if you don't have some kind of infrastructure that tells you how to use the legs effectively. The same with even a mouth and chewing and biting. There's all kinds of advantage built into the nuance. Sometimes it's all you need to do is grab something. Sometimes you need to chew something. Sometimes you need to swallow it whole. Sometimes you need to swallow it head first. These are all nuances that have to be built into the structure, that will be built into the structure, because there's an advantage to doing it right. And so now we start gaining reflexes. We start gaining control mechanisms. So the first control mechanisms were just chemistry. A chemical would go from one end of the body, like the mouth starts eating, and that would send a chemical it would release a chemical, and that chemical would end up at the anus eventually, and the anus would say, well, you can release all the old food we've captured, because we've got some new food to process, and so it'll be more efficient if we work on the new food and get the value out of it than for you to keep working on this old food, because this old food, we only got 20% of the calories left, and they're going to be hard to synthesize, so it'd be better if you just eject all that crap you've been saving. And these are the kind of mechanisms that have been built into these organisms. And so as the organisms get more and more complex, these reflexes get more complex. And you start getting reflexes on top of reflexes on top of reflexes, like where it takes In just the example of a knee jerk, instead of a knee jerk, there'd be you need 5 knee jerks in a row, and that would create a double knee jerk when there was 5 in a row, because something would be counting. Some other reflex would need the switch to be hit again, and again, and once it's hit the 4th time, then it goes off. And so that's basically the beginnings of a neural network, because that's basically what your brain does. It's a bunch of reflexes connected to reflexes, connected to reflexes, connected to a reflex, connected to a reflex. It just keeps reflexively processing stimulus input and measuring it against a standard of this is what the switch requires today, or this is what the switch requires tomorrow. Will be different, but the trigger mechanism is still the external world provides the input, provides the initial energy, you process that energy is then put into your body, into movement. And this is how all these mammals function. And so they're quite complicated. And then for mammals too, and for a lot of other creatures, probably all the way down to lizards and such, they're given a capacity to learn. So each individual organism hatches into the world and learns from its experiences. It has a good time going left, and then left is reinforced, and so now it'll do left more often. And this whole idea of a good time, meaning they can have a good time or a bad time. They can have a pleasant, attractive sensation, or they can have a sensation that's very repulsive. And repulsion can also be used as an attraction mechanism. If you learn that that's repulsive, automatically that is comforting. So it's not just about the sun feeling good, it's about the dark feeling bad. And so you have relative qualitative states that exist. So essentially your brain can say, put you in an artificial negative condition, like hunger, and say, satisfy that condition. And the reason why it's so nuanced is likely because these mechanisms these driving mechanisms likely need to be nuanced. They likely need to be circumstantially triggered. It was better to be hungry during the day than at night for most organisms, okay, because it wasn't going to be too good for them to go look for food in the dark when other creatures might be able to eat them because they couldn't see them. But that's all part of our individual history as mammals. Other animals have obviously other niches where the opposite is true. The daylight is the dangerous time. All right, so I argue that for the sentient being, what's basically happening is there's a 2-brain process. The first brain processes the world and the bodily structure, and it creates for you a 6th sense that you perceive, a sensation sense, an emotional sense. So it creates your hungers and your drives and your desires, and it also processes this external world and emotes on it and says, well, this is pleasant and comfortable, this is a good situation, or this is, in a different situation where there's fire or snakes or spiders, it's going to give you a different emotional reaction. And then your brain, another processing brain, lives in that world created, that enhanced world. So it still sees the old world, the other 5 senses are seen, but the 6th sense is applied over them, this emotional sense, and that's what we see as a consciousness. Our last brain processes that. And you could call it the subconscious and the conscious, however you want to talk about those 2 entities. But one's a feeling producer, and one is a problem solver. And so the second brain is this problem-solving brain that mammals have, this thinking brain, this reasoning brain. All mammals reason to some extent or another. They reason based on the information they have, the understanding they have, the learning they have. They don't go to school, so obviously they're not brilliant. But they do reason it out. They do logic to figure out how to live in their world. They're just very ignorant, so their logic isn't very elaborate or sophisticated. But that's what we do. So we process this 6th sense enhanced perception of the world, and it has a flavor to it, and we just say there's good flavors and bad flavors. We try to maximize the good, we try to minimize the bad. Pretty much the end of the motivational story for us, that's what our brain is. It's a scheming tool. It schemes a solution to the feeling dilemma. So we convert a bad situation into a feeling, and then we fix the feeling. So we don't really solve the external problem. We solve the problem created inside of us. That's why most people can't fix things or do something about something like world hunger or some other problem or war, unless it's something they can emote on. They have to have an emotional feeling to motivate them, because the problem has to be created inside their emotional self for them to be motivated to give a damn. And that's sort of how we're structured. Now, if you have enough logic and cognitive sense enhancement in your life, enough information, you will be able to generate those emotions even when there's no obvious triggers for them, like cuteness or familiarity or some other thing. You'll just understand it in principle that this is a circumstance where emotion is required. This is a circumstance that is in fact negative. And I will synthetically imagine some of the negatives just to create the impression that I should do something, like imagining a house being on fire without it actually being on fire. Just understand the context of a danger, and then you would say, well, let's put smoke detectors in the house so we prevent the horror of people screaming being on fire. This kind of logic is able to be facilitated through that process of using an imagination to measure different outcomes and model the world that exists and see it play out and be able to enhance it or nuance it, put a blonde wig on it if that'll make you care more. Your logic can do that. The structure of your understanding will do that. Your intelligence will play your psychology. You'll understand the limits and weaknesses of your psychology and apply guilt or some other mechanism where required. But again, it's all exists because it's a scheming tool. So there's no spiritual here. There's no holy, mystical God created it. No, it's a crude structure. It runs on a crude foundation. It's basically a gladiator war. A bunch of biological machines tearing each other to pieces to steal packets of energy. That's the other secret here. We are a very high-maintenance organism. As I call it, high maintenance and low productivity, which is a really bad thing. These are bad things to be. High maintenance and low productivity is a bad combination, and that's basically what we are. But most of these more complicated life forms, these organ-possessing life forms, these ones that do a lot of moving, require a lot of energy. The ones doing a lot of thinking, a lot of energy is burned in doing all that processing and that chemistry that's required. And so they have to steal a lot of energy from somebody because they don't make it. So they have to steal it from, they go out into the world and grab it from other things that have a lot of energy in them. And they can do that by, you can do it as a vegetarian, or you can do it by eating other organisms like yourself. You can just go out and steal it from something similar to yourself. And so basically humanity has been cannibalizing other mammals, their relatives, to steal their energy. To steal it, and that's what we've done. We've stolen it. But that's what they're doing. That's just adds more weapons to the gladiator war, adds a new element to the gladiator war that's a little bit disgusting. But that's all it is. It's just a gladiator war. There's just a winner and a loser in a survival of the fittest competition. It's war with absolutely no purpose. It's just war so one person says I win. So if you can imagine that, one side, we fight a big, huge World War III, and the only prize it's over, the only reason why we're fighting it is just so one of us can go, I win, and then die of cancer, and then have World War IV. That's the mechanism in place here. It's insidious and insane just for the purpose of replicating a DNA molecule. A DNA molecule, the same structure of molecule, just longer, just more pieces to it, is in this leaf. The same molecule. Both this and me came from the same ancestor. We were birthed by the same mother in history. The same Eve gave birth to both of these things. They both have a history you can follow, an ancestry you can follow to a common ancestor. And that's this mechanism. And that's all that's happening here. And your delusions of purpose and accomplishment and magnificence and it's just that. They're just all delusions. All there is eccentric psychology to feed eccentric biology that has the uneccentric, simplistically crude and stupid purpose of creating a survived mechanism, a mechanism that survives to replicate, leave its seed into the future. And so you can look at the earth and you can see tons of species that have insanely silly lives. It's like the salmon. They build their body up over a 3 or 4 or 5 year period in the ocean, become a magnificent, strong fish, and what happens? Well, it's time to replicate. So now we're going to just destroy you. And so they sillily swim up a stream, deposit their eggs, squirt their sperm, and die. This is the mechanism. It just doesn't care about any of these life forms as individuals. The machinery doesn't care that we feel, doesn't care about the qualitative value of that. We're just survival machines, and that's all there is. And yeah, so gladiator wars, consumption, reproduction, cannibalism, addiction, is the only ingredients of this mechanism. All it ends up being is a war for the sake of war, for the sake of saying I win. War for the sake of saying I win. Not to save anybody, not to rescue anything, not to prevent a harm, not to do any of that stuff. Just war for the sake of saying your DNA goes into the future. Period. It's not half your DNA. Because, I didn't get into the whole subject of sex and asexual reproduction, but it's not really necessary to understand. It's just about a DNA molecule mutating. The molecule mutates. The molecule evolves. We're just the mechanism. We're just the beaker that the molecule is allowed to evolve in. And that's how really dismal this whole thing is. The insult to the injury. The fact that the insult to the injury is the fact that we're not even doing the evolving. We're just the machinery that allows the DNA to evolve. That's what's happening here. A piece of chemistry is using us to play an environment game, like a TV game, to play the game with our bodies, with us as avatars. And it doesn't care about our welfare. We're irrelevant. And it's just about making the DNA molecule stronger and stronger and stronger, and stronger defined by the needs of a niche environment. All of this can be ruined tomorrow. All these living things that think they've survived millions of years, maybe hundreds of millions of years. Some of these organisms have been here for hundreds of millions of years and haven't changed. And tomorrow they could be wiped out by one new virus that has a new pointy stick that hits them in just the wrong place. And that's the truth of it. All of this, there's been 99.999999999% of the stuff that's ever lived on planet Earth as a species went extinct. That was their fate, because something came along with a pointier stick, and that was the end of their existence. So all of this stuff you don't even know when you passed or failed natural selection's test. You could last 10 years, you could last 1,000 years, you can last 100 million years, you can last 300 million years. And it really doesn't matter, because in one day it can all be over. By one change in the toolbox of some other organism, and you're done. These plants tomorrow could mutate, create a chemical, a strand of their DNA that would be toxic to all animal DNA. It's a theoretical possibility. A virus could be formed through this environmental processing. It does create viruses, and it could be formed, and it would unravel all complex DNA molecules. It could basically break them all. So any cell that infected it would eventually break every one of its molecules. It's a theoretical possibility, and it would have a lot of stuff to break. And so that's just how pointless it all is, how stupid, how unformed. It's unintelligent design. It's pleasant to look at. It's fun to have sex with some of it. I mean, this probably you don't want to have sex with, but it has some sexual imagery going on there. But yeah, that's all we are. Consumption, reproduction, cannibalism, addiction. Now we're doing it very eccentrically, but back to the same old line. It's crude structure, Okay, we're high maintenance and low productivity. Yep, enough of the video. I say now it is anyway. Yeah, I like this camera.